Welcome to the Lawyering Peace podcast series, where we explore the art of diplomacy, the practice of peace building, and the legal and policy frameworks that shape the global order. Today, I am truly honored to be joined by my good friend, Ambassador Elayne Whyte. Elayne, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Paul. It's very exciting to be here.
Great. Well, let me introduce myself in one quick sentence, and then let me turn to a bio of all of the things. It could take us the entire 45 minutes to cover your bio, so I've shortened it up a little bit into 2 or 3 minutes. But I'm the host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Now, today's episode with Elayne continues our exploration of paradigm shifts in the global order. We will discuss how global governance is evolving and how diplomats and negotiators are adapting to challenges that transcend borders and traditional state interests. Elayne is the perfect person to have this conversation with us. She's an experienced diplomat and academic with over 25 years of experience in policymaking, diplomacy, and negotiating international agreements. She served as Costa Rica's Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs in the early 2000s, becoming the first woman and person of African descent appointed to this position. She has played a crucial role in shaping Costa Rica's foreign policy through this position and other roles, such as the policy advisor and chief of staff to the ministers. And importantly, from 2014 to 2020, she served as ambassador and permanent representative of Costa Rica to the United Nations in Geneva. She played a leading role in shaping international agreements and cooperation frameworks across a wide range of fields, including human rights, global health, sustainable development, and international security. And she currently serves just down the road from where I am as professor of practice at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And she's also a member of PILPG's Circle of Former Ambassadors. Welcome to the program, Elayne. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
So am I. So am I, Paul. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, let's kick off with your origin story. When and why did you decide that you wanted to be a diplomat? Was this a childhood dream, or were you on a different trajectory and then all of a sudden decided that being a diplomat is what would be most intellectually engaging and give you a chance to make a difference? How did this come about? What's your story?
Well, yes, my story is that I developed my interest in international affairs during my early childhood, believe it or not. I think it was shaped by the influence of listening to the radio news that my parents would play every morning before driving me to school, by the newspapers that my father used to read before leaving for work. And I vividly recall, especially the 1970s, there were so many fascinating, interesting processes that were going on around the world. For instance, we had civil unrest and civil wars in Central America. We had coup d'etats in several places in the Latin American region. We had the negotiations of the Panama Canal, which I followed with my dad very closely. Also, the intensification of the civil protests in South Africa against apartheid. So every day brought news about these developments, and I used to pay very close attention to them. I recall that when I was in vacation, my dad used to say, here's the newspaper if you want to read it. And then at night, I would say, Dad, I saw this news, and we would comment on them. I have to say that obviously, being a child, the very first page that I read from the paper was the comics, obviously. But then the following page that I read was the international page or pages in the newspaper. So I developed my interest in nations, in international affairs, and how, in war and peace, and how nations could get along and solve problems at a very early stage. So when the time came to choose a career, I did have several interests, but my two great passions have always been international affairs and law. And I chose international affairs because it has a good component, a good dimension of law. And indeed, my career in diplomacy has allowed me to work and to combine both fields, my passion for law and international law, but also my personal conviction, my personal interest in finding solutions to problems that are common to different nations. I love understanding how different cultures and nations work, their histories, how they see the world, and how they are different from my own perspective. So I think it has been a whole life journey.
Well, Elaine, that was such a great answer because I ask almost all of our guests, and it's usually late high school, college, or they wanted to be a chemist and then decided they didn't like whatever it was, running experiments, and then they decided at some point in time that they want to pivot into international law. But you and I both share this passion for international relations from childhood on, in large part because of the way in which our parents exposed us to the world at an early age. Well, now, Elaine, the world that your parents and my parents exposed us to had a certain structure to it, had a certain order, and more or less was governed by rules. There seems to be a fairly substantial change at the moment in the rules-based order. And I guess I'm begging the question by putting the answer into the question, but do you see us undergoing a paradigm shift in the global order, or eh, stuff happens, we zig and zag. This is just more of the same. Just relax, Paul. Don't be so concerned about a paradigm shift. How do you see it?
This is a very, this is a great question, Paul. So yes, there is a big debate about what word or what term we use to describe the moment we're living through. I enjoyed this debate, but I think the ongoing discussion mixes several different questions, and I would like to separate at least two of them. On the one hand, yes, we are undergoing a profound change. We clearly have a shift in the global order understood as the distribution of power or the way in which power is exerted. The top tier of global politics is more crowded now. We see nations, India, China, many middle powers that have accumulated different forms of hard power that has put them near the summit. Yet at the same time, one country, the United States, still retains extraordinary economic and military capacity, and its decisions can still rewire trade, security, finance for everyone else. So yes, the summit looks a little bit more populated, but the hierarchy of the summit also resembles a steep curve still. That is, there is still a very powerful nation that can shift the world for everyone else. So there is a lot of talk about the transition from unipolarity to multipolarity. But when we are talking about this transition, the very first thought that comes to my mind is, yes, more peers in the top tier, but still we have a very powerful nation that calls the shots. Let us also distinguish the difference in narratives. You hear many leaders, especially from the global north, saying that the post 1945 global order is dead. You read their statements, their articles in journals, in newspapers. Yes, this language is dramatic. They say the order is dead. It is not about an order that is evolving or transforming, but about an order that is supposedly over. And I understand where this comes from. The institutions and the rules that you are mentioning that were designed when a small group of Western powers sat at the top of the table of the summit. And now that order is under pressure from new centers of power that were not present in the same way during most of the last 2 centuries. And certainly they did not have the same powers when the rules were written. But even if we acknowledge this transformation in the configuration of power, and even if everyone talks about transition from unipolarity to multipolarity, we still have a system in which one actor is capable of altering the overall system in ways that others cannot. Now, on the other hand, I am more cautious about the assertion that we are already in a full paradigm shift. If we understand by the word paradigm, these underlying assumptions, frameworks, and beliefs, that is the basic understanding about how the world is governed, who has the authority to set rules and interpret the rules. A paradigm shift is not only a change of who is in power, but it is a change in who gets to organize the system. And in that sense of the paradigm, I see more contestation and more direct clashes between facts and beliefs than a settled new paradigm. We are in a transition, but not totally. I would hesitate to say, yes, we are in a paradigm shift for the following reasons. If we are referring to a paradigm shift fundamentally altering how the order operates, for instance, moving from universalist UN anchored model to openly competing blocks or from state-centric governance to something else, what we see is competing narratives about the same order. As I mentioned, some powerful states from the West say the global order is dead. But if you review the narratives, the speeches and statements of emerging or middle powers, Brazil, South Africa, China, India, and others, they tend not to declare the system dead, but to insist on the need to reform its governance architecture so that it better reflects the diversification of power. They are not rejecting institutions or rules as such. They're asking that their voices and their power, and they are asking to have a better seat at the table. Representation, authority, and participation in decision making. I like to use the metaphor of climbing Mount Everest. In the 50s and 60s, perhaps only a few climbers reached the summit. Today, the summit is crowded, and that creates a different set of problems: congestion, risk, friction among those at the top, but the mountain itself is still there. So I think we have different narratives. For some actors, they talk as if the order and the paradigm is dead. Others argue that the order is still there, but that its arrangements must change to be fairer and more representative of today's distribution of power. My sense is that we are living through a profound crisis and renegotiation of the existing paradigm rather than a clean passage to a completely new order. I see important discussions in three axes. The first axis is about how we organize the relationships and the way in which we interact between states. Rules versus deals, right? Established rules, established institutions versus ad hoc deals. Hardware versus software. It looks like if states are constantly choosing between a system anchored in common rules and institutions and one based on short-term bilateral gains. But it is very interesting. I have heard ministers of finance, of ministers of foreign affairs, of important nations, middle powers, etc., and they say, We have a certain percentage of trade that is rules-based and another percentage that is basically with the United States that is deals-based. They know that rules provide predictability and protection, especially for medium and smaller states, and for economic and social actors that need planning, horizons, predictability. But they also know that in some relationships, especially with the very powerful nations, they have to negotiate. So most nations are still working in the two worlds. This is not yet a new paradigm. It is a fragmented and layered version of the old one, where universal rules are coexisting in an uneasy manner with transactional power politics. And nations are understanding that they do prefer rules-based relations, but that currently they have to combine the rules-based interactions with the deal-making interactions. There is a second axis that I think is a little bit deeper because it touches philosophy and values of our generation, which is the assumption of pulling together that was at the heart of the post-1945 project. After the two wars, a core insight of the new order of the UN Charter Order was that there were a set of problems that were indivisible, that pertained to all nations to solve. Security, financial stability, global health, those are issues that cannot be managed in isolation and that need the collective, the community or the system of states to solve. So this concept of building together, of facing problems together, I think is the backbone of this international system. Is cooperation. We cooperate among each other. And that understanding is not dead, but it has been openly questioned. I don't know if you recall the September 2017, the UN General Assembly, when President Trump delivered this America First message, that I think it did something radical new in normative terms. They made it socially and politically acceptable for all states that wanted to follow that trend to have a different narrative, to put the nation first rather than the international collective.
Elayne, let's pick up on your comments related to that second axis. And given the decades that you spent working in multilateral diplomacy and multilateral institutions, walk us through how that has evolved in the last decade and in these last couple of years. As you say, with global health, human rights, disarmament, you still need multilateralism, either diplomacy or institutions. But they seem to be under, these institutions seem to be under a significant threat, pressure, strain. And as you mentioned, a number of countries, India first, Pakistan first, Japan first, Indonesia first, they're following in the steps of America first. What are some of the challenges, but also what are some of the opportunities that we're facing when we think about multilateralism?
So if we want to have a view of the last decade, I would say that, well, there have been some cycles that we need to understand. First of all, we have lived through something that I call a golden age of negotiation for global problems. There was a time, especially between 2015 to the mid 2020s, that states managed to conclude a series of extraordinary sequence of multilateral deals focused on solving transnational problems without passports, problems of humanity, whether it was the 2030 Development Agenda, that Sendai framework to create or to elevate the world's capacity to deal with natural disasters or disasters overall, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the Global Compacts on Migration and Refugees, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the so-called Ocean Treaty, also the Pandemics Treaty. So across very different domains, nuclear weapons, disaster, risk, climate, states use multilateral diplomacy to build platforms for cooperation on global public goods and global crises. So that is something that we really need to acknowledge as a very defining factor of the last years. By 2025, we are now entering a moment when these frameworks needed to move from design to implementation review, to take stock, evaluate what has worked in the last 10 years, what doesn't work, and how to recalibrate. We need to see what we have learned from the process. For instance, whether ambition on paper is enough without finance and technology flows, whether to have big universal frameworks can be translated into regional and national strategies, the question of justice and distribution of the costs and the benefits. In reality, there's this big discussion about global problem solving, which is who pays, who adapts, who moves. That cannot be treated as secondary. So I think in 2025, we will needed to enter an era of recalibrating, identifying lessons learned. But at the same time, since 2020, the political environment crossed a threshold, especially with the pandemic, when we started to see even the most liberal or globalist leaders return to what we can call neo-Westphalianism. They started to exert national sovereignty and to think about the policy tools to think about, say, my country first, and to somewhat distance themselves from the global problem solving. So right now we are in a moment in which we are seeing that states are still acknowledging that there are global problems to be solved, but they are prioritizing their national interests. And it is a moment in which, let's say, there is some sort of a recession of thinking and negotiating about global problems. It was very difficult to obtain or to achieve a pandemics treaty. And there was another treaty that has been under negotiation to address the problem of plastic pollution. That has not been able to conclude successfully. So now the other challenge that we see beyond the attention moving from global problem solving to competing interests in this new environment, the other challenge that we see is that what we can call some sort of a deconstruction of the global agenda setting and the institutional machinery. We know the institutions like the United Nations are under very deep and unprecedented financial and political pressure. Their budgets depend heavily on a few contributors, mostly two. When one pays late or attaches political conditions to its contribution, it directly erodes the organization's capacity to deliver on development, human rights, or on basic administration. At the same time, we are seeing a growing discourse that says, we have been trying to achieve too many things. We need to go back to the core business, which is conflict management. The problem is that this core is precisely where the architecture is most constrained, because the Security Council remains structurally deadlocked whenever interests of the major powers are engaged. So we risk a combination of shrinking resources, a narrower agenda, and deadlock of an area that nations expect a lot from multilateralism. Now, in terms of opportunities, we have to also acknowledge that the system itself, that is, nations working together, have been trying to somewhat respond and somewhat adapt the system, the agenda, and the institutions. So we have, for instance, a Summit of the Future and a Pact for the Future that has updated the agenda of the United Nations. We can say that it is a blueprint for the United Nations of the future. that incorporates the challenges of the emerging technologies together with the traditional topics that we have been addressing: Security Council reform, nuclear weapons, sustainable development, but also including new commitments to address the problems of digital governance, to rethink the financial architectures, and to see how we can bring younger generations to the discussion of global problems. Also, there is a UN 80 reform agenda. There are attempts to update the machinery, to see where institutions are located, where funds are being cut, what kind of efficiencies can be obtained. So there is indeed an opportunity to address some issues, especially the bureaucratic agenda that had been stalled for decades, and that now we have the opportunity to really thoroughly think whether this architecture that we have can function in a more effective manner. But let me just mention one aspect, Paul, because sometimes these are problems that we create ourselves as states, because we are the ones that give the mandates and create the institutions. So one characteristic that we all need to understand is that it is also something that happens at the national level. Normally, centuries ago, societies had a problem. Let's say they wanted to address health or labor or education. They created machinery, they created an institution and a legal framework to deal with one issue at a time: health, education, nutrition. They did exactly the same at the international level. So we now have, as a legacy, a series of institutions that have specific mandates, but we know today that problems are multifaceted, multidimensional, and we need to see how we adapt this architecture that was created with the mentality of the 20th century to give it functioning dynamics that best resembles the world of the 21st century, that is interconnected, that is systemic. And this is part of the discussion that is happening in New York today. So there are huge challenges. Now, are these challenges, can we say they're larger than they were, for instance, at the height of the Cold War? Um, Perhaps very similar. Perhaps very similar, because during the height of the Cold War is the period when the architecture saw most challenges to actually deliver on expectations and on the mandates. So today we are seeing political, financial challenges. What concerns me more is the normative dimension, is the adherence to the norms and the principles and the rules by everyone, is to apply the rules indistinctively for everyone at the same time. That is because this is not the rules-based system in reality, Paul. I think that you would agree with me. This is not the legacy of 1945. Every single field that we see is the result of centuries or sometimes even millennia. If we think about the efforts, humanity's efforts to curb war and violence, we would even have to go back to St. Augustine or Thomas Aquina and the efforts to start creating rules to avoid the destruction of war. So this is not only the legacy of our grandparents, it is the legacy of all of humanity that has been building a system centuries after centuries, building on top of the lessons learned of the previous historic period. That is what concerns me the most, Paul, what so many actors call the selectivity in the application and the culture of compliance with norms and legal obligations.
Well, Elayne, let's move from global multilateralism all the way down to the state level, and in particular, small states. And I want to get your thoughts on Costa Rica and the fact that Costa Rica is generally acknowledged to, as the British would say, punch above its weight or have an outsized influence. And actually, Costa Rica had an outsized influence on my development. In 1988, I had a chance to have a coffee with Oscar Arias Sanchez, former president. This was a year after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. And my buddy Tony Arnold and I had the opportunity for a 15-minute conversation with him. And we were both studying environmental law. And he said, well, one of you should do environmental law and one of you should do international law. There's so much to be done. I now have a professorship in international law, and Tony Arnold has a professorship at Louisville University on environmental justice. And that conversation with the former president, Nobel Peace Prize winner, really inspired us as baby lawyers to undertake our fields of study. And then also I spent spring break my first year in Costa Rica and realized, wow, yes, what an amazing country. My wife and I have been back there 5 times since that time. So talk to us a little bit about other than impacting Tony and I, how is it that Costa Rica has managed to have such an outsized influence on regional and on global affairs? And you were there as the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. You were one of those people having an outsized influence. Walk us through the strategy and the vision of Costa Rica.
Well, this is very interesting. I usually consider myself to be part of the what I call the generation of hope, because I am part of that generation that saw, for instance, in Central America, move from civil wars to peace, development, and regional stability. It was my first job at the Inter-American Institute of Human Rights when I had the opportunity to assist as a research assistant to assist the election observer mission to the elections in Nicaragua that saw the end of the Sandinista regime, to see the first woman ever elected in the whole region, Violeta Chamorro, who recently actually passed away. And then I saw with my own eyes the whole of Latin America moving towards democracy away from military rule. So I, as a diplomat, I have to say that I am part of that generation of hope that saw transformation, and the transformation was possible. I had the privilege of discussing exactly this question about small states and Costa Rica with Joseph Nye when I was at Harvard some years ago. And it was actually very interesting to have this conversation with him when he was discussing about precisely his book, Soft Power. And for him, Costa Rica was an interesting example of how a country with limited hard power could still project influence through ideas, institutions, example, by exerting leadership, as you mentioned, by exerting leadership at the regional level, by promoting that the nations of the region engaged in a peace process rather than a military solution to the civil wars. So we states don't rely obviously on aircraft carriers or tanks or big economic power, but we rely on how we position ourselves in multilateral arenas and how we contribute also to the compliance with international law. Because if you think about it, Paul, we are at this moment 193 nations. They are members of the United Nations. And you would have to understand that most of the implementation of international agreements is really in the middle and in the middle powers and small states. Imagine if it were the other way around, that only the powerful nations comply with the legal obligations, and the larger part of the international community were in breach of our legal obligations. So we're also big compliers. We comply and we contribute to the implementation of agreements. But at the same time, we exert leadership in building machinery, in building norms, in building regimes, because we think that a rules-based order is not an option, is not a doctrinal or ideological option. It is a realist option for us to have a world that first is predictable, and second, a world in which the small nations or the smaller nations are protected by law, rules, institutions, by monitoring, by dispute settlement. There is an aspect that I would like to mention from my conversation with Joseph Knight, because he talks about Costa Rica in a way that was inspiring for me, because he said that one of the reasons why Costa Rica had such influence at the multilateral level was because of the coherence, because we chose to exert leadership in areas that were strengths at the domestic level. If we chose to exert leadership in the protection of human rights and the promotion of democracy at the global level, that is exactly something that we could show the world in which we were being very coherent in respecting human rights and in promoting democracy. The same can be said with the promotion of the environment. So, in general terms, it is said that we nations, small nations, engage at the global level through several strategic tools. First, coalition building. Second, by participating and engaging in the conceptual debates of the international community without feeling that we were small, but with the conviction that we had something to say and that we could actually contribute to the discussion by many times bringing the discussion a little bit further in the level of aspirations, whether we were discussing human rights or the environment or state compliance with international obligations. Small states can also contribute by raising the level of aspirations and by contributing in framing the discussion in ways that can bring all nations together. So coalition building, active engagement in world debates, but also there is another aspect that is less visible, and that in the case of Costa Rica and many other small nations, we tend to use to resort to international litigation more than middle powers or large states. Let us just cite an example. There are, from the almost 30 cases that International Court of Justice has heard from the Latin American region, almost around 40% of those cases have been presented by small nations of Central America. We have a preference to resort to international law and to seek a third party that can assist us when we have a difference or a conflict with a neighbor or another member of a regional community. In that way, and this is especially important for a region like Central America that has a very successful integration process that creates a lot of intra-regional trade, it is very important whenever we have a conflict between two neighboring nations, we have been able to somewhat encapsulate the problem by bringing it to a third party, which is the International Court of Justice, so that we don't, let's say, we don't poison the regional dynamics and the regional dialogue by discussing bilateral issues. So in general terms, we build coalitions, we engage actively in the discussion of global problems, we comply with international obligations, and we also resort to all the mechanisms that international law has provided for the peaceful solution of disputes.
Well, Elayne, let me pick up on what you've just said about the region of Central America, because it sounds like there's quite a bit of interest in rules-based system by the states of Central America, because they can use that international system, the International Court of Justice, international arbitration to solve those disputes. Do you also see Central America operating as a region, maybe collectively as a middle power region, so to speak, as one particular pathway of this shift in the global order, global paradigm is regionalization? Oftentimes there's a hegemon in each of these regions. There isn't in Central America, as far as I can tell, depending on where you put Mexico. How would you, well, I guess, how would you describe Central America, Mexico's role? And then separately, do you see Central America beginning to come together as a region and exercise power and influence as a collective middle power, or no, that's not going to happen?
I think Central America is a very good example of how a region can be both strategically placed and play a strategic role, but also can be very vulnerable if we don't exert leadership and if we don't act together. So, for instance, as we have been mentioning in several moments, on the positive side, Central America has a record of doing something that at the wider international system is more difficult, which is using regional diplomacy to solve regional problems or even national intrastate conflict and civil wars. So we came together, and at the regional level, we achieved an agreement to solve national civil wars because we understood that being a region, conflict and violence in one country is going to spread to other nations. So we built the Esquipulas peace process that you talked about. It was led by our president Oscar Arias, that helped end civil wars and opened the door to democratic transitions and to regional integration again. We have been very successful in negotiating as a region, let's say, to consolidate the main sources of revenue, which is by trading with the rest of the world and with ourselves. So the region has been super successful in protecting its international trade by means of treaties. So we have our own integration mechanism that protects our intra-regional trade through a legally binding mechanism. We have also been able to secure our trade relations with the US through a free trade agreement with the US and also with the other trading partner that we have, which is the European Union. Our most important trading partners or trading relations are all protected under law. So that is a very a fundamental issue. Now, is Central America has a low level of interstate conflict for the reasons that we actually mentioned. But at the same time, the region is deeply tied to the broader international system in a very asymmetric way. So economically and socially, Central America is highly integrated with the US, with the United States. Trade, investment, and migration and remittances make the US market and society absolutely central to the macroeconomic stability of all of the Central American nations. In some cases, in some countries, the remittances from migrants account for a very significant share of GDP and macroeconomic stability. So we have a region that is very close to the US in terms of daily interaction, but still very vulnerable also to other pressures, for instance, transnational organized crime that use the Central American region as a passage corridor towards the United States. And that the influence in the impact of narco traffic in using Central America as a corridor has increased in the last decades and putting the Central American nations in a much more vulnerable position. So we have strengths. We have strengths in safeguarding the economic dimension of our interaction with ourselves as a region, but also with the United States and with the European Union. But also we need to acknowledge that very positive dimensions of this regional order that was achieved after the peace process are also under huge stress. So we have democratic backsliding in many of the regions. Economic growth is either uneven or is not really translating into inclusive development. We have the impact of organized crime and the geopolitics of narco trafficking. And on top of that, the regional security model also is being challenged precisely because of this erosion of transnational organized crime. And also because we have recently an increased interest by the Russian Federation in establishing a closer military cooperation agreement with one of the nations in the region in Nicaragua. So that could be a disturbing element in the relationship between our nations and with the relationship between our nations and the United States. So yes, strengths and weaknesses. We have a lot of strengths to build on, and we also have a lot of weaknesses that represent the huge vulnerabilities for the definition of our future trajectory as a region.
Well, Elayne, you mentioned inequality in terms of state power between smaller states, larger states, trade, economic. There's also inequality within states. Pick any state around the globe, and there's inequality within that state. How do you think inequality and inclusion, or inequality and exclusion, both on the global order and on the state stage, are impacting the effort to sustain a rules-based order or to move into a new, more inclusive, more equitable global order? And if so, what would be your vision of a inclusive and equitable global order?
Mm. That's exactly the objective that has been at the top of the global agenda for decades. You might remember in the 70s when the nations of the global south shaped the concept of the new economic order because they wanted a more equitable order based on trade and better integration into the financial markets. But we have to acknowledge one dimension that is critical in this 21st century. There has never been this level of progress in human history, of wealth generation and human progress in terms of the access that all humanity at this stage has to health, education, technology. At the same time, there has never been so much inequality in the distribution of wealth and the distribution of growth. That inequality is, in reality, as you point out, also undermining the internal cohesions, the internal national projects in many nations, because there are important segments of the population who are losing faith in the political systems because those political systems, especially democracy, is not delivering in terms of human progress, in terms of better standards of living. That increased frustration is leading many populations to experiment with different political models, especially the rise of nationalism and populism in many areas is in many countries, certainly in the Americas, then we're seeing that is a response to that increased frustration with democracy, with democratic institutions, because they have not been as effective in delivering a more equal access to the benefits of development. Exactly the same problem we are witnessing at the global level, that where we are seeing more concentration of power and of resources in the hands of the few nations. But you can also say that there are opposing trends. On the one hand, there is increased inequality at the global level, and you can see one of the indicators that is being referenced a lot lately is the fact that most of the population of the world today live in nations that devote more resources to servicing their international debt than to social expenditure, health, education. We see that on the one hand, especially for some small nations, and on the other hand, many actors that are increasing their participation in the most dynamic sectors of the world economy. Let's say Costa Rica is one of them. We are a small nation, but we have been able to profit from our interaction with the world economy. And we now, as of this year, we have graduated. We're not a middle income economy, middle income country anymore. We're a high income nation today, but we have the problem of the geographic and social distribution of the benefits of that development. We also are confronted with a very interesting dilemma that there are some nations that are resource rich and can actually participate in the supply chain of critical minerals and other strategic commodities. And maybe they now have an opportunity to negotiate better terms for their participation, not only in selling the commodities, but in building alliances that would allow them to give more value added to those commodities at the national level, so their international exchange would have more value added and more technology at the domestic level, and just to receive a better share of the benefits. So we would say there are some agenda items that are old, are part of an older reform agenda. For instance, the reform of the Security Council of the United Nations, or the reform of the voting rights in international financial institutions. Those are dimensions that we have inherited from the power asymmetries that were present at the time when the system was created in 1945, and that countries are increasing their voice to request a reform of the system that's more equitable. So altogether, inequality, because that was your question, inequality is a critical element when we are thinking about a more stable, rules-based order, because we need to make sure that at the domestic level, people feel satisfied with what they can obtain from the system. And at the global level, we need to also undertake reforms so that the participation of the global south, middle powers, and small powers is a better representation, better mirrors the ongoing power distribution and the ongoing realities of economic power.
Well, Elayne, when we think about inequality, distribution of wealth, access to technology, we immediately bump into artificial intelligence. And I'm curious for your thoughts. In our warm-up conversation before we push the record button, you and I were chatting quite a bit about artificial intelligence, but I didn't have a chance to ask you your thoughts on this, which is artificial intelligence. Is it going to be the bridge to overcome inequality? Is it going to put power, economic, political, otherwise, in the hands of anybody who has a cell phone or an internet connection? Or because of the centralization of innovation and the companies which own and are developing AI in the United States and China, is going to simply exacerbate inequality? What impact will artificial intelligence have on the global order?
Well, I think artificial intelligence is amplifying existing asymmetries. In that sense, yes, as you mentioned, the innovation and the ownership of the companies that are innovating in AI is also concentrated in specific nations in the global north. At the same time, we have around 2.6 billion people that remain offline. So the digital divide is huge. And to overcome the digital divide, there are other divides that need to be addressed. For instance, if you want to increase connectivity, you need to have hardware. Let's say you need to have at least a phone, but you need to have Yes, connectivity. And guess what else you need to have? You need to have stable energy, stable electricity, so that your device is going to be connected in real time. So on top of these realities, we risk what we can call a next great divergence. Productivity and value are going to be still concentrated, and those who already dominate the data systematization, the cloud, and critical minerals. And you also have the divergence of labor and labor intensive export models. In poorer countries, they are going to be less competitive because they are not going to be able necessarily to incorporate all the innovation that is being incorporated in the services industries. So it seems as though the artificial intelligence is basically amplifying the already existing and maybe magnifying the already existing asymmetries. There is also the debate about data sovereignty that we have heard about, and digital rights, about ensuring that the data generated by people and communities, whether in small states, in large, or in middle powers, serves their own development, their own human rights, and not just the interest of a few firms or a few governments that are developing the innovations, the technology, but also concentrating the data. So if we design AI governance around non-discrimination, meaningful consent, if we invest in trying to close the basic connectivity and skills gap, then AI can become a trigger to more inclusive access to health, to education, to finance, to justice. It can be an equalizer then, because people would have access to knowledge in ways that previous economic models did not guarantee. So there is this opportunity to have an AI governance model aspiration with principles that can somewhat balance the equation. And also together with the conversation about how the nations that actually can participate in the supply chain of critical minerals can engage in better and equal terms in trade and processing, not only of the critical minerals, the trade of critical minerals, but also in the processing of those critical minerals.
Well, Lane, I have one last question for you. And you spend most of your time with young professionals, students, as a professor. What do you tell them, share with them about your vision of the future, your hopes, your dreams, your aspiration, and what do you share with them about how they should be thinking about the future, either so that they're in an optimistic mindset and can make the most of it, or so that they're in a cautious mindset and can guard against pitfalls?
Well, first of all, I always convey to them my strong belief that all paradigms don't start from zero. That the principles, as I mentioned previously, the principles that came out of 1945, sovereign equality, non-aggression, human rights, respect of human rights, the idea that certain problems are indivisible and must be governed together, they are still essential, and they are not the creation of, let's say, one big bang. They are the product of human evolution. So the question for future diplomats is how to protect those foundations in a world where power is more diffuse, where politics is more polarized, global risks are more acute. We are in an age in which we have an unprecedented level of interconnection and fragmentation at the same time. We're all interconnected, we are interdependent, at the same time, we're very fragmented. So my advice is that we need to treat multilateral rules and institutions and all the governance agreements as something that We need to inherit, administer, and to think how we innovate and adapt them to the realities of the 21st century, how to reimagine those principles and how to make them fit and work in the realities of the 21st century. Above all, we cannot forget that we need to put big attention to the voice of other actors, not only states, that they're small, the most vulnerable are to be at the center of our attention, to always look to improve justice, equality. I think the history of the 20th century was a history of achieving better control of the exercise of power and at the same time achieving better justice for human beings. Those two continue to be aspirations of humanity, and we just need to continue thinking outside of the building, outside of the box, to see how those same values find expressions that are closer to the realities of today, but still respond to this overarching human aspiration of justice, of freedom, and equality.
Well, Elayne, those are certainly words to live by, not only for young professionals, but also for, I guess you and I are senior professionals, senior professionals like ourselves. The pursuit of justice, the pursuit of that human instinct to make the world a better place. Elayne, you've been so generous with your time. This has been such an enriching conversation for me, and no doubt for our listeners as well. It's been a real privilege to have this conversation with you, but also an honor and a privilege to have you on PILPG's circle of former human rights ambassadors and all the great work that you do with our PILPG team for promoting exactly what you're talking about around the globe. So thank you for everything that you've done and that you continue to do to make the world a better, more just, more equitable place, and for your enthusiasm and commitment to multilateralism and to diplomacy over force. So thank you very much, Elayne. It's been a real pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope to be back again soon.
Great. I look forward to that.
Thank you.